today, I'm finishing up our exploration of who Cornerstone Christian Fellowship is. We've talked about our core values for the last few weeks. A little pop quiz. Anyone remember any of our core values? You can shout them out. We stay at the table. Yes, you don't count because you're an elder's wife. What else? Where you receive and offer God's grace abundantly. You're a deacon, so that kind of, I don't know. What else? We multiply leaders. Okay. Yes. Cindy, you said? We learn and discover. We embrace it. She's an elder, so. Yeah, she's an intern. Yeah. I mean, that's multiplying leaders. Everybody here is basically one of the leaders. Yes, we love fiercely. And then Steph said, someone over here said, we value and respect all people equally. Yes, those are our core values. And I can see Tracy wrote them down to make sure we got them all. So we're done with those, but we had one more week, and we wanted to throw in something else. No, there's one other element of who we are that we wanted to highlight, because I think it really shapes something that you can kind of feel intuitively through the way we do church, which is we're doing things a little differently. And the idea that we're talking about today is, what does it mean to be a center-set community? That's a phrase that we use often, but we wanted to talk more about what that means in practice. At the same time, it's also the first week of Advent, which is a church tradition that helps Christians prepare for the celebration of Christmas. And the first week of Advent is often given the theme of hope. For any of you who grew up in a traditional church like I did, you'd have a little Advent wreath, and you'd have pink and purple and a white candles, and you would light, the first candle would be purple, and you would say, this is the hope candle. And so that's kind of some of the tradition that goes around this time of year. And last week when I was preparing my sermon, my wife said, well, it's also Advent. Can you put the two together somehow? And I'm like, challenge accepted. So we'll see how well this works out. It might be a two-headed monster. But I've been thinking about how do we connect these two ideas of the center set and the hope that we receive in Advent. And here's what I got. Advent and the center set build a gospel or an understanding of the gospel of hope to those on the edge or those on the boundaries. But being on the edge means being outside the center of power, being on the periphery, people who are not seen as the most well-known or archetypal of the group. People who are a little weird, a little uncouth. And so I think the point that God's trying to speak between this strange mashup is there's a special hope for those on the edge that we can really grab onto during this Advent season. So since we're putting together these two ideas, I want to talk about them a bit separately and then try to bring them together. So first, and this slide just describes what I said, the hope of Christ. So let's talk a little bit about Advent. The story of Christ in the New Testament starts with a variety of people who are on the edge. The real action doesn't start with the high priest or the Roman governor or the king, though those actors are mentioned in passing. Each of the Gospels starts with a story of Christ's coming through the eyes of people far away from the center of religious and cultural life. If we go book by book, Matthew starts with a couple, unmarried, living in a quiet rural village, who are about to be publicly shamed. They broke the rules of purity and were due, at best, a quiet life of hidden embarrassment, or at worst, a complete removal from their community, all because they got pregnant before they were married. The Gospel of Mark starts with the story of a man appearing in the wilderness, not in Jerusalem, not where God was supposed to live. He echoed the words of a prophet, and he was weird. He was uncouth. He was sharp and brazen. He wore animal skins and ate bugs. And he was not really in alignment with the religious norms of the day. He was a man on the edge. The Gospel of Luke starts with a woman who was viewed as defective because she did not bear her husband a child. When I read the story of Elizabeth in the book of Luke, I remember how in Kenya, Steph, my wife, was viewed as essentially a child until she gave birth to our twins. She was greeted as a child. Her power structure, like where she fit in society, was that of a child, and other women kind of didn't really interact with her. The way you would greet her would be by tapping her on the head. Once she had children, she was fully part of the community. And I think it's easy to forget this, especially as men, that this little story about Elizabeth, it's like, oh, she was barren, that's too bad. That's putting her on the edge of social life, of community life. This isn't someone, even though she married a priest, she was really pushed out in some ways. And then in the book of John, we go back, after kind of his big opening, we go back to the story of John the Baptist, and we see a specific kind of realization of his being on the edge. The religious leaders of the day come to him and try to figure out, are you in or are you out? Do you align with the boundaries we've set up to understand someone as close to God or evil? So these are the people that introduce each of the Gospels. And that's not even to mention the shepherds, the foreign astrologers, the fishermen, tax collectors, prostitutes, all of whom were at the margins of society. Their position and standing were tenuous. They were barely holding on by a thread, and yet the story focuses on them. They are the ones at the heart of God's work on earth. They are the people God uses to announce and proclaim his arrival, not those firmly established, powerful, legitimate maintainers of the true faith. He came to the outsiders, the questionable, might I say the queer, those who push the boundaries or find themselves on the wrong side of the fence. In the words of Mary, the mother of Jesus, this is good news for the humble and the hungry, and more challenging news for the rich, the rulers, and the proud. The light of hope burns brightest not at the center, not at the temple or the most holy place. The light of hope, the light of Christ coming, burns most fiercely in the backwoods, in the wilderness, in the homes of the socially questionable. This is the hope offered to us today on the first week of Advent. Now, part 2, the centered set. And just to start, this diagram, I don't know if it makes any sense. This was all me. But it's kind of my way of thinking about the center set. So if I just did a real quick overview using these diagrams, the top circle is the center set. You have a center, and then some people are facing toward it, some are not. The white circle is less important. That boundary isn't important. You see, those in orange are kind of indicating people moving toward the center, and those in gray, those arrows are moving more away or kind of alongside the center. while the bounded set is more clearly defined. It's the boundary that matters. You have those in orange are those inside the boundary, and those in gray are outside. I don't know if that'll help, but that's a starting point. It makes sense to my head. So, I take a lot of my thoughts around this idea of being center set from an article written by Paul Hebert from the 70s, which started with a question about what is a Christian. And it was an interesting little scenario he looked at of a man in India, a Hindu, who hears someone present and talk about Jesus, feels something stirs in his heart, and then says, yes, I want to follow that. Is he a Christian? And he kind of wrestles with this idea of, at face value, many of us would say, yes, well, of course. Like that moment that you say yes, you are part of Christ's family. And yet, when you dig into it in practice, there are many boundaries people would put in his way to say he's really part of a Christian community. He has some worldviews that probably need to get worked out. He's wondering, do I still worship at my temple but worship Jesus now? Does that replace all of my other gods? Can I tell my family about this? Can I do this publicly? There's all sorts of things that he needs to work out that could be seen as barriers put into place before some communities would say, this person is really a Christian. And I think that's a natural outflow of how we think about things generally, at least in the Western world, the way we use English language. Most nouns are essentially a bounded set. They have specific characteristics, and there's things that are something or aren't something. And we often have all sorts of conversations and arguments about whether something is or isn't a thing, right? So if we take an apple, right, we kind of have an understanding of what an apple is, like the tree it comes from, what it looks like. It's kind of round. It's usually red, green, or yellow, and we eat it raw. We can eat it cooked. And when I go to the supermarket, I don't look at the produce and say, which ones are apples? Like, there's a very clear understanding of what things are and aren't. And that's just the way we look at the world, and that is fine. And, we have all sorts of fun little arguments about, like, is a hot dog a sandwich? Or whether this is a hill or a mountain, or is that dress gold and white or blue and black, right? These are the things that become important to us because of the way we structure our thinking is around this is or it isn't. And when someone disagrees with what we think, we have arguments, and it's fun, and you throw hot dogs at each other, right? Now, the challenge is this is how many people also will naturally think about the church. They define the church as people who are willing to adhere to specific characteristics. You believe and acknowledge certain things, and they do or they don't do certain actions. And this is how, like, a church might view people who want to be part of their community. The challenge here is that for all bounded sets, the emphasis will naturally flow to defining and solidifying those boundaries. We want to know who exactly is in and who exactly isn't. Who can we tolerate? What kind of difference can we tolerate? And what can we just not? It needs to be rejected and removed. Centered sets are built around a different way of viewing the world. Instead of defining a group based on its clearly defined attributes that are static, you can define it by a center, point of reference. And then you look at how is everything oriented to that center rather than is it within the boundary. So An example of this might be, let's draw a line around all of the people who live above 50 degrees north latitude. That's basically pretty Arctic tundra area. And you could just imagine the line that defined that set of people would be a circle, that line of latitude. And that line would stay the same. People could move in or out, but generally it's pretty static. The line, that set, remains the same. And everyone in that group, there's a lot of uniformity to it. Compare that to draw a line around every person who is facing more north than south. Think about that set. It would change all the time. It would, dip down and, zip around all over the place, and it would be fluid. And the things within that set would be very different. It wouldn't be homogeneous at all. That's one way to think about the difference between a center set and a bounded set. Here's another metaphor that is kind of helpful. We've talked about this once or twice before here. Imagine sheep being raised in the Australian outback. And this was my picture for it. I had AI make that picture. I thought it was pretty good. Good job, AI. In the Australian outback, there are lots of ranchers with sheep, but it's a dry, pretty arid place. And so they have large swaths of land, probably dozens, maybe even hundreds of square miles, that the sheep wander around. And they're looking for grass, they're looking for water. One way to make sure your sheep stay out of trouble and can be controlled by you is to build a fence around your ranch. And that makes sense, like you want to keep the sheep in. The challenge is, that's an enormous fence. And it's going to cost a whole lot of money, and you're constantly going to have to be going around the edge of that fence because the sheep are always going to want to get out, to get to the other side. Another way to keep the sheep near is to drill a well, right? Provide the water at the ranch, and the sheep will come. And this is kind of just another metaphor or way to think about how a center set versus a bounded set works. And at CCF, we believe that the church is best viewed, at least for us today, through this lens of centered set. The loving God who created all, is before all, and loves deeply. That is our center. And pursuing a deeper relationship with God is our aim as a community. And again, the sheep metaphor kind of reflects how we view following Jesus. We could create all sorts of boundaries or rules and regulations about how and when you have to be before you can be in the church, but we believe that in Christ, we have life. We don't need to fence people in or out. We need to display the living water that flows through following Christ. Now, practically, this shapes how we function, how we do church, how we live as a community. For example, we welcome people who are pursuing God from all sorts of places, whether they've wandered far from the church or have been close to the church all their lives. That doesn't matter. Where they are, where they've been, how they define themselves, doesn't matter. What matters is, are you turning toward Christ today? We invite and challenge people to orient their lives toward Christ rather than align with a large set of stated beliefs and practices. And that means we have to trust ambiguity. We have to understand that people are going to then understand their faith differently. If we're not making you sign off on a binder of beliefs, which absolutely there are churches that do, then we have to be okay with understanding that how you think about baptism, how you think about the afterlife might be very different than how I do. But that's okay within this community because the boundaries aren't what matter. We can take that diversity of thought and practice and turn it into a strength rather than something that's constantly pulling us apart. This is what being center set means to us. So, what then? How do we put these two ideas together? How do we take the hope of Christ and this idea of center set and merge them? To tie these ideas together, I want to talk about boundaries a little bit more. And when it comes to access to God, as I've been thinking about this, I think that the boundaries created by humans are where things most often fall apart. Boundaries are where our human tendency to grasp for the knowledge of good and evil interferes with our ability to enter into the righteousness of God in that moment. Boundaries are where we took something that God said once and then apply it categorically so that we don't have to think or decide about what's right over and over and over again. In some way, it's a lazier approach to morality. I'll make universal rules instead of clinging relentlessly to God and to listen to what God has to say today. But what do you mean? On the other hand, many Christians would very honestly say that the Bible is all about boundaries. That is a way that many people look at our faith, that the boundaries are good, that they're clear reminders that tell us how to live. The Bible is a user manual for life, which tells us how to act. The boundaries are the beauty of the Bible. Even when we're uncomfortable with them, they're what help us to closely cling to God. They act as consistent reminders of what following Christ means. How can I say that boundaries that we create around access to God are where things fall apart? Well, here's my response. Let's look at Christ's ministry. How did he interact with those boundaries? Well, in two kind of equal and opposite ways. First of all, he tightens the boundaries. So on the Sermon on the Mount, Christ's opening statement, he says, here's the boundaries you think that God cares about. But really, that's not even it. He cares about your motives, your intention, your heart, much more than these external deeds. Boundaries fail because they tend to focus on the external actions rather than the internal motives or intention. Because, why? The people who are judging and maintaining the boundaries don't know your motives. I can't see what your heart is, and so I need something that I can judge, that I can police. And so I say, what can I tell? Well, I can tell how long your hair is. And so therefore, let me say how long your hair should or shouldn't be to be acceptable. That has nothing to do with what God is caring about. But it's what I can see. And so that's how one way that the boundary falls apart. And Christ went right at that and says, you are measuring the wrong things. You are looking at the wrong indicators. And then after that, Christ also, throughout his ministry, widens and flexes those boundaries. I think one of the greatest themes that I see in all of the Gospels, across them, is this contention between Jesus and the Pharisees about breaking the rules, right? So he found boundaries and he broke them. He pushed them. He flexed them. The Sabbath is one of the biggest examples. He does all sorts of work on the Sabbath, according to the current thinking. And that Sabbath was such a core piece of what the Jewish people thought it meant to rely on God. Like, this isn't a bad thing. You know, they were saying, okay, God said we need this Sabbath, and so let's make sure that we do this. Our nation was punished. Our nation was exiled because we didn't observe the Sabbath. So, example of this, Mark 2:23, Jesus was going through a grain field with his disciples, and they start to pick some heads of grain to eat, probably because they're hungry. That was considered work. It was a type of harvesting. And so the people who saw it, because I guess people were kind of walking alongside, watching them all the time, were like, "What are you doing, Jesus? Your people are breaking the rules." And he said, "Do you remember King David, your great hero? He broke the rules too when he needed to." And then here's what he said. "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath," right? Jesus took the rule and the boundary created by humans to kind of legislate access to God and flexes it back toward the intent of God, away from set, static human interpretation. This is a pattern that he follows over and over again, like when he is meeting with the woman who caught in adultery, eating with tax collectors and sinners, talking with the woman at the well, his interactions with Samaritans, healing outsiders like the Roman centurion's servant, healing the paralytic on the Sabbath. Again and again and again, he identifies the boundaries created by humans to police access to God as the heart of the problem. He wasn't angry at the people on the boundary. He was angry at the boundary keepers, because that was the deviance away from God's heart. And I believe that's the dynamic that the gospel writers were intentionally or unintentionally pointing toward as they begin their stories at the margins, with the outcasts in the wilderness. The hope of Christ is for those at the boundary, on the edge. The religious leaders in every culture are going to have this temptation to set the rules to keep the wrong people out. And the good news of Christ is that God doesn't work like that. We are looking at things in the wrong way. Christ proclaims to people near and far, "Come follow me." This is good news for those who've been told you are on the wrong side of the fence. And as a church, our response shouldn't be to try all the harder to set better boundaries. We're not getting it right. We're not getting closer. We're just making the same mistake all over again. Our response should be to imitate Christ, to point toward Christ as the source of life and hope and grace and every good gift, and de-emphasize the boundaries that indicate who can be close to God and who can't. When you look at the edges, if you zoom into those boundaries, the firmer the boundaries are, the more likely we are to push away people who truly deserve to be welcomed as part of God's family. When we focus on the boundaries, we fall into the trap of replacing the hope of Advent with the firm dividing line of religious law. So, how can we then, as members of Cornerstone, as this community, live out this hope of Advent as a center-set community? We do this. We provide a home, a place of welcome and belonging to those who find themselves on the wrong side of one of the church's many boundaries. We exist as a place where people can be comfortable asking honest questions and get honest answers about what following Christ means, because it is okay if you have a different thought. We invite many people to speak into the direction of our community, to speak into this worship experience of our community, looking to incorporate the outside voice, which is often the prophetic voice in the wilderness. We allow people to disagree and be uncertain about who is right and who is wrong. We are a church that follows Christ fearlessly, even when he leads us into desolate or unsettled places. We believe that being close to Christ, that aligning close to the gospel, doesn't mean mimicking the fence builders, but rather aligning with the rule bender, being guided by the living words spoken by the Spirit today, rather than a a codified interpretation of what was a living word in the past. And that gives us deep hope. We have hope that God's mercy is widening to more and more people. We have hope that by exposing the rivers of life flowing through this place, people from all walks of life, from near and from far, will see true life and be drawn, like those sheep in the wilderness, back to God at work. And through the power of his Spirit, through the magnetic call to follow him, lives will be radically transformed. Institutions will be redeemed in Christ's name. Injustice will be overthrown by love, and the right ways of God will become as close to us as our breath. This is why we celebrate Christ, the Savior, being born on the boundary. Amen.